"2,500 years ago, a Greek city flourished in a quite spectacular way. Out of this place came extraordinary things: philosophy, theatre, and a great political idea. The city was Athens, the idea democracy. Democracy triumphed briefly, then was forgotten. Yet today we venerate it as the cornerstone of Western civilization. In Washington, the greatest superpower in the world champions Athenian ideals: liberty, equality, and freedom of speech. But are we really the guardians of Greece's golden age?
These perfect white columns seem to me to be a great metaphor for what we've done with the classical past. We've taken the world of the ancient Greeks and we've whitewashed it. We've turned it into a kind of fantasy. We look back at ancient Athens and we see what we want to see, not what was actually going on.
I'm going back to ancient Athens. To dig deeper, to look at the grit as well as the glory, and to discover the true story of democracy.
If you say the name Athens, certain images immediately spring to mind. A beautiful Greek vase, enlightened philosophers, the Parthenon. This is a place that we cherish as the first free and equal society, a good, solid basis for our story of democracy.
But beneath the Golden Age ideal was a city that constantly voted to go to war, and that ruthlessly carved out an empire to enrich itself. A city which championed freedom of speech, but couldn't tolerate criticism from within. And now's the perfect time to dissect the idealised picture of Athenian democracy, because so much has recently been discovered that casts new light on what actually happened here in the Golden Age. "500 years before the birth of Christ, 3 centuries before the rise of Rome, the world was dominated by the great empires of Asia. Europe remained the province of primitive tribes. But this world order stood on the brink of cataclysmic change. A new power, Persia, had swallowed up the great civilizations of the Middle East, forming the world's first superpower. The empire of the King of Kings spread from the mouth of the Indus to the gates of Europe. But beyond the borders of this first world empire, a small, dynamic place was making a noise. Wedged between east and west lay a mountainous collection of islands and strips of land, each ruled by one of hundreds of rival city-states. Just one of these was the ancient city of Athens. In the 6th century BC, Athens was dominated by the Acropolis, a jagged fortress of prehistoric limestone, crowned with simple stone structures where the people made sacrifices to their gods. In its shadow was the Agora, the centre of the city, where the Athenians came to buy and sell, talk and debate. It was the hub of Athenian life, one of the busiest, noisiest places in the Greek world.
It's probably huge private buildings and small sanctuaries and things of that sort.
Archaeologists have been excavating this site since the early 1930s. Their basement storerooms are packed with artefacts from 5,000 years of Athenian life. John Camp showed me round.
How many artefacts have you got in here?
Catalogued one, something like 250,000. And then we keep a great deal of the pottery and fragments because that tells us the date. And down here,
The layers of archaeology here show us that Golden Age Athens was built on prehistoric foundations.
before it was the Civic Center, it was a burial ground. And so in the Iron Age and Bronze Age, there were lots of tombs. We have several hundred tombs, and so we have the remains of various people who were buried here long before this was the center of town.
So this is, what, about 1000
Somewhere
BC?
between 1000 and 1500 BC.
I think we always forget that the classical Athenians were walking on the ghosts of the past. You know?
Yep, very definitely.
In recent centuries, the Greek states had emerged from a dark age and transformed themselves. Greek shipping now spanned the Mediterranean, making trade with Palestine, Africa, Italy, and the Black Sea. These were warrior societies, but the Greeks didn't go in for individual heroics, they fought as one. In massed ranks of soldiers called hoplites, they protected one another with their shields. All across the Greek world, populist military dictators, tyrants, backed by these citizen armies, grabbed power from traditional elites. Ironic that in Athens, the path to democracy was smoothed by tyranny. Tyrannos is a Near Eastern word, which initially referred to relatively benign rulers who were sometimes even supporters of the common people. But as time went by, the Greek tyrants started to live up to the name as we understand it. From the 5th century BC to the present day, tyrant has become synonymous with an abuse of power. By the end of the 6th century, Athens could no longer tolerate the vindictive regime of the tyrants. They were expelled by a group of aristocrats who began fighting amongst themselves. It was this conflict that would help spark democracy. On the one side, Isagoras, backed by Athens' rivals Sparta. On the other was Cleisthenes, who desperately needed a tactic to counter his enemy's military muscle.
Cleisthenes came up with a shocking plan. He appealed to the mob, the rabble, hoi polloi as they're called in Greek. The historian Herodotus tells us that Cleisthenes welcomed into his faction the ordinary people.
If you are a member of the elite, you thought the people were not the people as a whole. It's the masses, it's the unwashed masses, the mob. Democracy was power of the poor people over the rich.
Now hope was stalking the streets of Athens. The people had tasted power, and although power is relatively easy to hand out, it is almost impossible to take away.
When the aristocrats tried to impose their power, the people rioted and stormed the Acropolis. They overthrew their rulers, and without knowing it or planning it, democracy was born. What had begun as one man's solution to a problem would turn in the next 50 years into a completely new system of government. No one knew that what had been invented was the first direct democracy.
At the time of Cleisthenes, the concept didn't even exist. The word democracy comes from demos, people, and kratos, power or grip.
Mind you, it caught on pretty quickly. Within a couple of generations, the word was everywhere, and soon the city would worship democracy as a goddess.
Democracy is an extraordinary surprise. They didn't replace one set of rulers with another set of rulers, as has happened for thousands of years in the West. They said, no, actually, why don't we try something extraordinary? We can rule ourselves.
In a world controlled by kings and cliques, the Athenians created, almost by accident, a remarkable experiment in direct popular rule. And they transformed their city specially to house the new system. Opposite the Acropolis, people would assemble on the hill of the Pnyx. Any citizen was allowed to attend, and a vote of the assembly was law. The assembly was chaired not by career politicians, but by ordinary citizens chosen at random for a term of 1 month. They were put up at state expense in the circular tholos. Next door was the council chamber, where 500 ordinary citizens met each day. It was their job to prepare the agenda for the assembly back on the hill of the Pnyx. If we were to follow Athens' example, we would have a different prime minister each month, selected by lot, and we would all take our turn in parliament. They didn't elect people to make decisions for them. They ruled and were ruled in turn.
Was this section excavated?
We have reason to believe that this is one of the law courts.
Archaeologists have unearthed tangible proof of the Athenian pursuit of equality.
Because of this
They found an Athenian ballot box.
When it was excavated, little bronze discs like this, 7 of them were found, and they carry an inscription on them, as you can see. They say, public ballot. And you as a juror in the law courts would be given 2 of these, one with a solid axle and one with a pierced axle.
One disc represented a vote for guilty and the other for not guilty.
You would hold them so people couldn't see which way you were voting, throw one into the ballot box, and a verdict would be arrived at.
Fantastic. A lot of thought has gone into this, hasn't it?
No, they want to make sure that the jurors don't feel coerced in any way.
Yeah, so plenty of checks and balances.
It has to be a secret ballot. The courts are tremendously important for the functioning of the democracy.
Yeah. Mind you, I'm a woman, so I wouldn't have been allowed to vote.
That's true.
I'll do it now.
To make sure that the jurors were fairly chosen, brilliant technology was devised.
This is called a cleriterion, and it was a random selection machine. Now, how it works is that individual citizens would have their names inscribed onto metal tags that would then be inserted into each of these slots. Down the side here, there would have been a wooden chute, which of course hasn't survived over the millennia, and down the chute would be sent black and white marble balls. If your name lined up with either a black or a white marble ball, it meant that you were or you weren't going to be selected that day. And because this process happened every day that there was democratic business to be done, it was impossible to bribe jurors or to pull rank so that you were always chosen. It shows just how important equality and fair play was to the early democracy.
In theory, you can be the magistrate that proposes a law, you can sit in the assembly and vote for the law, and then 4 months later you could be sitting on the jury that's going to decide how it's to be interpreted or if it's even constitutional. You can hold any office in the state.
A seismic shift had occurred, but in a world where rule by the many was confined to one city in 1,000, the survival of the infant democracy was in peril. Democracy might not have survived had it not been for a windfall that made Athens rich. At the bottom tip of the Athenian peninsula lies Laurium, the industrial heart of ancient Athens. Even today, the landscape is littered with the spoil of hundreds of abandoned mine shafts. Although off the tourist trail, Laurium has an important story to tell. That the Athenian Golden Age was actually built on silver.
People have been mining here since the early Bronze Age because the rock is so rich in mineral deposits. But then in 483 BC, the Athenians struck a giant seam of lead, carrying within it precious particles of silver. Overnight, democratic Athens was filthy rich.
Recent excavations have uncovered a complete settlement of tiny houses and streets.
The conditions here are pretty cramped. But actually, it's not that different from other towns and villages of the period. What makes this place different is that. This building has just been identified by some archaeologists as the remains of a watchtower.
The living quarters surrounding the tower were not occupied by citizens, but by slaves.
Seems the Athenians wanted to keep their slaves under 24-hour surveillance. And it's no surprise they were jumpy. We are talking massive numbers. As many as 1 in 3 of the people who lived in Athens were slaves. The Athenians could be such vigorous democrats because they had someone else to do their dirty work for them.
The Athenian citizens felt their freedom all the more keenly as the owners of people who had lost theirs.
In ancient Greece, liberty has an inflection which it doesn't have in our society, namely there are an awful lot of unfree people, I mean slaves. And in fact, not far from where we're standing right now was one of the slave markets in the centre of Athens. We mustn't forget the dark underside of the democratic achievement.
Most slaves began their lives as free men and women, but were forced into a life of manual labour when they became prisoners of war. They were bought and sold, separated from their families, sterilised so as not to breed. It wasn't only slaves. In fact, 9/10 of the population were barred from voting. There was an age restriction, and it wasn't enough to be born in Athens. Both your father and your mother had to be born there too. And of the remaining free Athenians, half, like me, were automatically disqualified. Women weren't just unequal, they were believed to be demonic, possessed by daimones, spirits. They needed to be controlled, visibly restricted. In fact, the first hard evidence of the full face veil comes from Athens.
Women were not meant to be seen. All the evidence of vase painting would suggest that the woman is veiled. She has her cloak draped over her head.
Should we ever have a go?
Sue Blundell is researching the status of women in Athenian society.
And just drape it over your arm like that. Then if you want to cover your face, you can go like that.
Yes.
Lovely.
Well, look, I match. Sophocles said, silence is the greatest ornament of the woman. I feel nicely silent like that. I hate it. It makes me feel really claustrophobic. The message that's being sent out is that a married woman is the possession of the man.
Yes, he is the one person in her life for whom she will unveil herself, yes.
It wasn't only Athens, almost every society till the 20th century has been fiercely patriarchal. But there was, in that searing mass of experimentation, the possibility that something different could have been done. Where do we hear about that? We hear about it as a joke. Aristophanes imagines what would happen if women took over. We hear about it as philosophical thought. So Plato imagines what happens if we got rid of the family and had women as well as men as guardians of his republic.
But of course it didn't happen. Only the free men of Athens could belong to the Democratic Club, which met together on the Pnyx.
At dawn, Athenian citizens would come here to sit around on the bare rock and debate in the assembly how it was that they should run their own lives.
So we're going to do an experiment in Greek democracy. So who's for?
The purpose of life for an ordinary human being in Athens was political life.
And who's against?
It's absolutely unparalleled in world history.
So the motion's carried.
And
Mogens Hansen is a world authority on Athenian democracy and how it worked in practice.
This is where the people meet to pass their laws, to pass their decrees, to elect their prime minister, and they all do it by show of hands. That's the voice of the people. The Athenians believed the name Pnyx was derived from the adjective pyknos, which means crowded or densely packed. The Pnyx covers 2,400 square meters. A person takes up 0.4 square meters if he sits down. Thus, it could accommodate 6,000 citizens.
Important legislation needed to be endorsed by a vote of 6,000, and that's exactly the number of people Mearns has worked out could fit onto the crowded Pnyx.
But it's impossible to count 6,000 hands.
Mearns went to the cantons of Switzerland, where they guesstimate the vote.
First, I took photos, and then I blew up my photos. And with a pencil, I dotted each hand, so I could check that this was a fair method of deciding a majority in a large assembly.
You think this is their way of doing it?
Yes, it is. Aristotle shows that they did the same in Athens.
Just think of the hubbub of the assembly. 6,000 men here together. Shoemakers sitting next to nobles, and all debating issues which directly affected their lives. Heralds kept order, and there was a police force of slaves nearby if things got out of hand. But we're told that if the crowd really disliked one man's argument, they would shout him down until the roar reached to the skies.
So seriously did Athenians take being a player in democracy that they called people who didn't participate idiotes, which gives us our word